In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Gladiator build. This is an all-game axe build that you can use from the very beginning of the game, all the way through New Game and New Game Plus. And a lot of people have been asking me for an axe build, and there hasn't been a lot of reason for me to make an axe build. Axes are not one of the stronger weapon groups of the game, in my opinion. But in my testing with Ashes of War, because I'm going to be doing an Ash of War video here coming soon, I found one that I really like with the axe, and I'll explain why I use it in this video. So let's get into it. So let's get into the axe that we use for this build and the Ash of War. I'm going to talk a bit more about the Ash of War because it's kind of what inspired this build, but let's take a look at the axe first. This is the Highland Axe. I really like this axe because it's one of the longer axes that you can use in the game, and axes themselves have very short reach, so that's kind of nice. It's in the top 3 in terms of damage, in terms of infusible axes, and it also has the highest critical rating of all axes. That means if you do like a block counter, and you do a critical attack, or you do a backstab, or you do a parry and a critical attack, you're going to get more damage out of it than the other axes. It's actually the only axe that has 110 critical rating. This weapon also gives a passive benefit to roar attacks. We're not using roar attacks with this build, so that's not used. But if you were to use this weapon with, some sort of roar, you would get even more advantage out of it. Now, again, you can use any axe that you like for this build. This is just the one that I like, and this is available in Stormveil Castle, so it's not super far into the game. So let's talk about the Ash of War I'm using for this build. That is a Stamp Upward Cut. Now, I've never used this Ash of War in any other builds that I've done, but let me tell you why I like using it on axes. So Stamp Upward Cut does 33 stance damage to an enemy when it connects, no matter what weapon type you're using. And usually when you're using this, you're using it with like a great sword or a colossal weapon or a great hammer. And in those cases, you're actually having less stance damage, because when you use a charged R2 attack with those weapon types, you're doing more stance damage than 33. The exception here is hammers and flails, which are very light compared to those weapons and, are about the same weight as an axe. However, they actually have increased stance damage as well, so they lose out here as well. The only weapon type that actually gains more stance damage by using this is the axe. Now, there is a negative to using the axe with this build, and that's that the damage of Stamp Upward Cut is dictated by the attack rating of the weapon that you're using. So if you're using a heavier weapon with higher base damage, higher attack rating, higher scaling, etc., you're going to come out way further ahead in terms of damage every time you use this ability than an axe. So if you really wanted to min-max this build, you would probably replace the axe with like a great axe or a colossal weapon. But I was challenging myself to make an axe build, and one of the reasons I chose this Ash of War is because of the increased stance damage when you're using axes. You also don't have to use an axe for this build. You could use a straight sword if you prefer to make a Gladiator build with a sword, or you could put like a sword in a backup slot in case you want to swap between these. And you could use Square Off. Square Off actually does even more stance damage. It does 40 stance damage when you use the R2 version of it, the L2 R2 attack, which is way more than this by 7. So that's really good. But the advantage of using Stamp Upward Cut is that when you go in for that lunge, you actually gain hyper armor, so you can poise through attacks, and you also gain a 50% damage reduction when you do this. So you take far less damage, you're not going to be interrupted, and you can connect like 90% of the time with your uppercut. And you're going to have more of a problem with Square Off because you're not going to gain that hyper armor, and you might get interrupted when you're doing that attack, and you'll also get hit for more damage. So when you trade, you're going to lose more health. However, I just wanted to bring that up as it is an option you could use for this build if you prefer. When it comes to the shield that we're using for this build, we're using the Red Mane Great Shield, and that's because I feel like it fits the style of the armor that I'm using for this build, but it doesn't particularly matter what Great Shield you use. We have a lot of strength for this build, so it makes sense to use a Great Shield if we're doing a block counter setup or a one-handed axe setup. We don't really need to dual-wield axes. They don't have the greatest moveset in the world, and we're really leaning into that Stamp Upward Cut weapon skill anyway, so that doesn't make a lot of sense if you're going to dual-wield. But you can use any Great Shield that you want. I also want to mention here that I'm using the Cold Infusion on my axe, and that's because it's about the same damage as Heavy when you go about everything. And it also allows for that Frostbite status effect, which helps to increase the damage that enemies take and rips off some of their health. But you can really use whatever infusion you want for this build as long as there's some strength in there in order to use a great shield. Taking a look at the set of armor I'm using the Rotten Duelist set along with the Bull Goat's gauntlets, and I've altered the body piece here in order to remove the sort of cape so you can see the helmet because I really like the way this looks. This does lower the poise a bit, making it so that you have to basically use like really, really heavy gauntlets to meet that 51 poise breakpoint, which you absolutely want, but isn't super necessary for this build because you are going to be able to poise through things with Stamp Uppercut anyway. You can really use any armor you want for this build. It does help to have 51 poise for regular attacks, though, because you will use them sometimes, or R2 attacks, etc. But you really won't need them because of the hyper armor, so it's kind of up to you. Moving along to the talismans, I of course have Shard of Alexander here to further increase the damage of Stamp Upward Cut. That's a no-brainer. I also have the Dagger Talisman to further increase critical damage. We have already higher critical damage than any other axe with this. So when you do like a block counter and stagger an enemy, you're going to deal even more damage to them. You can get almost 2,000 damage when you do a critical attack with a single axe, which is impressive in my opinion. So this is really nice for this build. I also have the Bull Goat's Talisman to help me get to that breakpoint. You won't be able to hit 51 poise without that with this armor set unless you're using a different armor set. If you're using a different armor set, you can replace this, but I like to use that here. And for our fourth talisman, it's kind of our flex spot. Sometimes I put Millicent's Prosthesis here in order to give me like an attack power increase and some extra dexterity for extra damage when I use R1 attacks. They are quite fast with this weapon, but also the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger is really nice because if you use Stamp Upward Cut, stagger an enemy, then do a critical strike, you'll actually refund the cost of that ability, plus a couple of points of FP, so you can actually net positive FP by using it. That's really nice. It's not so good in boss fights though, so maybe something like the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman would be better there, where you can give yourself more protection and you're not going to be getting a lot of critical attacks in those fights anyway. Also, this is a good spot to mention that if you're using the Sacrificial Axe and you're using Stamp Upward Cut, you're gaining 4 back if you kill that enemy, and then, that'll help reduce the cost of that basically from 13 to 9, which is even more cost effective. We don't have any spells or buffs with this build. This is just like a straight up, axe and shield build that, leans into its weapon skill and uses block counters and, R1s and running R2 attacks, etc. There's no like spectacular hybriding with this, and I know I haven't made a lot of builds that don't buff, so if you appreciate a build that doesn't buff at all, then this is a really good one to use. So taking a look at the attributes we have for this build, I got 50 Vigor, 18 Mind, 30 Endurance, 50 Strength, 45 Dexterity, 25 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 9 Arcane. Now the intelligence I have here is simply because I'm on the cold infusion of this weapon to further boost some of my magic damage. Once you get to about 50 strength and 50 dexterity, you really don't get as much out of these anymore, and intelligence will actually scale better if you're cold. This gives you a lot of room to grow with this weapon and actually have very high attack rating with it. But if you want to use a different infusion, you probably won't have any intelligence. I would recommend early on in the game prioritizing strength, maybe picking a heavy infusion, or maybe the fire infusion early on where you can just, pump strength, not worry about dexterity and intelligence. That way you can get that great shield used sooner, and then, if you want to switch to something else after that, that's not a bad plan. Vigor is a bit lower than we want at this point. We want to take this to 60 in New Game Plus. You do trade damage a lot with this build. I mean, it's a very aggressive build, but you do mitigate a lot of that damage with Stamp Upward Cut because you take 50% less damage when you're using the lunge part of it. So just having a huge HP pool, though, will allow you to, lunge through those attacks repeatedly, keep knocking enemies into the air, keep staggering them, or, critically strike them after you knock them down without having to back up and use an HP flask. 18 Mind is there because this is not an FP hungry build, particularly if you are using the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger in one of these slots, like out on the landscape. You'll refund Stamp Upward Cut most of the time. You don't have any buffs, so we don't really need a lot of points on Mind at all. I've got 30 Endurance here in order to be able to use the equipment I'm using in Still Medium Roll. You probably don't need exactly 30. You could probably get away with 27 or 28 here in Still Medium Roll. But Endurance is very good for this build because Stamp Upward Cut uses a lot of stamina. So it's just good to have in general. And if you want to use a heavier armor set, then Endurance is going to help out as well in order to allow you to medium roll. And you don't need any Faith or Arcane for this build. I would say, though, that if you're using like a pure physical damage infusion like Heavy or maybe Bleeding or Poison, something like that, or even Quality later on, maybe picking up 15 Faith, get Flame Grant Me Strength might not be a bad choice for like boss fights. So some final tips before I wrap up this video. If you're talking about which Great Rune to use, Godric's is not a bad choice, especially if you're going the Cold Infusion. You got 6 stats there that you can use, and again, if you take a little bit of Faith and use Flame Grant Me Strength, you can get some extra damage. So that's not a bad one early on. Radahn's is also not bad. Health, FP, and Stamina are all good. You don't really need much FP, but Health and Stamina are also good for this build. When it comes to the Flask of Wonders of Zeke, I like to use the Green Burst Crystal tier to increase my stamina recovery. This is pretty much a staple for most of my builds. But I also like to use the Stone Barbed Crack tier to increase the stance damage that we do. A lot of boss fights, I like to go in and just go for stance damage and try and break their stance using Stamp Upward Cut. So getting a 30% increase to your stance damage for 30 seconds might not seem like a lot, but it can really power you through a boss fight real quick. Particularly if you're playing on NGA Plus or beyond, because bosses have higher poise on those difficulties, making it harder to stance break them. So that wraps up our Gladiator build. I hope you guys enjoy. I finally did it. I made an axe build. I hope you guys enjoy it. There are no buffs involved. It's just a straight up tank and spake type build. I really, really like it. And I'm amazed I've never really used Stamp Upward Cut that much before. I've seen other players use it in co-op a lot and thought, that looks powerful. But I don't know, it never occurred to me to use it in a build, and it works very, very well here. We do have an Ash of War video coming. I don't know if it's going to be this week or next week. That's going to be showing the heavy Ashes of War and talking about what their strengths and weaknesses are. sort of branching out into this series that we've been doing with weapons, kind of moving on into other aspects. And we do have some other miscellaneous videos coming as well, so stand by for those.